The HOA cops walked through the quiet cemetery, their flashlights cutting through the evening light. It was a routine patrol, something they did every week to ensure everything was in order. But today, something felt off. The air was heavier, and the silence seemed unnatural. As they moved deeper into the rows of graves, one of the cops, Officer Harris, stopped abruptly. "Hey, look at this," he called to his partner, Officer Miller. They both approached a grave that looked no different from the others at first glance. But as they got closer, they noticed something unusual. On the grave was a small, weathered bunny toy. It looked old, its fur matted and dirty. But what caught their attention were the black needles sticking out of it. The needles were arranged in a strange pattern, almost like a symbol. Harris reached out to touch it, but Miller grabbed his hand. "Don't! Something's not right here." They exchanged uneasy glances. "What the hell is this?" Harris muttered. "I've never seen anything like this in my entire life." Miller crouched down, examining the bunny and the needles more closely. "This doesn't look like a prank. It's too deliberate. Someone put this here for a reason." The two officers stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the discovery settling over them. Finally, Harris broke the silence. "We need to report this. Let's head to the church and talk to the priest. Maybe he can make sense of it." Without another word, they left the cemetery. The image of the bunny and the needles burned into their minds. Whatever was happening, they knew it was just the beginning. The cops hurried to the small church at the edge of town. The lights were still on, and they could see the silhouette of the priest, Father O'Connor, moving inside. They knocked on the heavy wooden door, and after a moment, it creaked open. Father O'Connor's kind eyes narrowed with concern as he saw the officers. "Officers, what brings you here at this hour?" Harris stepped forward, his voice low but urgent. "Father, we need your help. We found something strange at the cemetery. It's hard to explain." Miller added, "There's a grave with a bunny toy on it, and it's covered in black needles. It doesn't look like anything we've ever seen before. We thought you might know what it means." Father O'Connor's face turned pale. He stepped back, gesturing for them to come inside. "Show me," he said quietly. The officers led him to the cemetery, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. When they reached the grave, Father O'Connor knelt down, his hands trembling as he examined the bunny and the needles. After a long silence, he stood up, his expression grave. "This is black magic," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Someone has placed a curse here. The bunny and the needles are part of a ritual meant to harm the family of the person buried in this grave. If we don't act quickly, it could destroy them." Harris and Miller exchanged worried glances. "What do we do?" Miller asked. Father O'Connor closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. Then he said, "There is one person who might be behind this, someone who has dabbled in dark arts before. But he's not in the city right now. He left a few weeks ago, and I fear he's the one responsible." "Who is it?" Harris asked. "His name is Victor Kane," Father O'Connor replied. "He's a dangerous man, and if he finds out you're investigating him, it could put you in great danger. You must be careful." Miller nodded. "What do you suggest we do?" Father O'Connor looked at them intently. "One of you should go to the home of the family affected by this curse, see how they're doing, and if they're aware of what's happening. The other should find Victor Kane. But remember, he must not know you're following him. If he suspects anything, it could end badly for all of us." Harris and Miller agreed. They knew the stakes were high, but they had no choice. They had to stop Victor Kane before more harm was done. Officer Harris drove to the home of the family whose grave had been cursed. The house was on the outskirts of town, a small, run-down place with peeling paint and a sagging roof. As he approached, he noticed the front yard was overgrown, and the windows were dark. It looked like no one had cared for the place in years. He knocked on the door, and after a long pause, it creaked open. A woman in her late 30s stood there, her face tired and worn. She looked at Harris with hollow eyes. "Yes," she asked, her voice barely audible. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Harris. I'm here to check on you and your family. May I come in?" She hesitated but finally nodded, stepping aside to let him in. The inside of the house was even worse than the outside. The furniture was old and broken, and the air smelled of mildew. In the corner, two young children sat on the floor, their clothes dirty and too small for them. They stared at Harris with wide, fearful eyes. Harris's heart sank. "Ma'am, can you tell me what's been going on here? Are you okay?" The woman sighed, her shoulders slumping. "We're not okay. Nothing has been okay for a long time. My husband died a few months ago, and since then, everything has fallen apart. We've had no money, no food, and no help. It's like we're cursed." Harris's stomach churned. He thought of the bunny and the needles, the black magic Father O'Connor had mentioned. This family was suffering, and it wasn't just bad luck. Someone had done this to them. "Ma'am," he said gently, "I think I know what's happening, and I promise you we're going to fix it. But I need you to stay strong, okay? Help is on the way." The woman nodded, though she didn't look convinced. Harris left the house, his mind racing. He needed to contact Miller and find out if he'd made any progress with Victor Kane. This family couldn't wait much longer. Meanwhile, Officer Miller was on the trail of Victor Kane. Father O'Connor had given him a description and a few leads, but finding the man wasn't easy. Victor had left the city weeks ago, and no one seemed to know where he'd gone. Miller started by visiting the places Victor used to frequent: bars, old friends' homes, even abandoned buildings where he'd been known to practice his dark rituals. Each lead turned up empty, but Miller didn't give up. He knew time was running out. Finally, after hours of searching, he got a break. A bartender at a dive bar on the edge of town remembered seeing Victor a few days ago. "He was acting strange," the bartender said, "kept muttering about finishing what he started. He left in a hurry, but I think he mentioned something about the old mill outside town." Miller's heart raced. The old mill was a crumbling structure deep in the woods, a place where kids dared each other to go, but no one actually visited. It was the perfect hideout for someone like Victor. Miller called Harris to update him. "I think I've got a lead. Meet me at the old mill, and be careful. Victor's dangerous." Harris agreed, and the two officers set off toward the mill, their flashlights cutting through the dense forest. As they approached the building, they noticed a faint light coming from inside. Someone was there. They moved quietly, their training kicking in. When they reached the door, they could hear faint chanting. Miller peeked through a crack in the wood and saw Victor Kane standing in the middle of the room, surrounded by candles and strange symbols drawn on the floor. In his hands was another bunny toy, this one covered in black needles. Miller signaled to Harris and they burst through the door, their guns drawn. "Victor Kane, put your hands up!" Miller shouted. Victor spun around, his eyes wide with shock. For a moment, it looked like he might resist, but then he dropped the bunny and raised his hands. "You don't understand," he said, his voice trembling. "I had to do it. I had no choice." "Save it," Harris said, cuffing him. "You're coming with us." Victor Kane sat in the back of the police car, his head bowed and his hands cuffed. He didn't speak during the drive, but his silence was heavy with guilt. Harris and Miller exchanged glances, both wondering what had driven this man to such dark actions. When they arrived at the church, Father O'Connor was waiting for them. His face was stern as he looked at Victor. "Bring him inside," he said quietly. They led Victor into the church, where the atmosphere was tense. Father O'Connor gestured for Victor to sit in a pew, and the officers stood nearby, watching closely. The priest began to speak, his voice calm but firm. "Victor, what you've done is unforgivable. You've brought pain and suffering to an innocent family." "Why?" Victor looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and defiance. "You don't understand," he said again. "I didn't want to do it, but I had no choice. They made me." "Who made you?" Harris asked, stepping forward. Victor hesitated, then shook his head. "I can't say. If I do, they'll come after me. They'll come after all of you." Father O'Connor knelt in front of Victor, his expression softening. "Victor, whatever hold they have on you, we can break it. But you need to tell us the truth. Only then can we help you." Victor's shoulders slumped, and he began to cry. "It was a group, a cult. They promised me power, but they wanted me to do terrible things. The curse on that grave was just the beginning. They said if I didn't do it, they'd kill me." Miller's jaw tightened. "Where are they now? Who's in charge?" Victor shook his head. "I don't know. They move around, never staying in one place for long. But they're watching. They're always watching." Father O'Connor stood up, his face grave. "We need to remove the curse before it's too late. "Victor, you're going to help us." Victor nodded, though he looked terrified. The priest led them back to the cemetery, where the bunny and the needles still lay on the grave. Father O'Connor began to pray, his voice steady and strong. He carefully removed each needle, one by one, as he recited ancient words of protection and healing. Harris and Miller watched in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. When the last needle was removed, Father O'Connor turned to Victor. "It's done. The curse is broken, but you must face the consequences of your actions." Victor nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I know. I'm ready." With the last black needle removed, Father O'Connor stepped back from the grave, his face pale but resolute. The air around them seemed to lighten, as if a heavy shadow had been lifted. Harris and Miller exchanged glances, feeling the shift but unsure of what it meant. "The curse is broken," Father O'Connor said, his voice steady, "but the damage it caused won't disappear overnight. The family will need time to heal, and Victor, he must face justice for what he's done." Victor sat on the ground, his hands still cuffed, his head hanging low. He didn't resist as Miller helped him to his feet. "I'm sorry," Victor muttered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't want to hurt anyone. I was just scared." Harris shook his head. "Being scared doesn't give you the right to destroy lives. You'll have to answer for this." Father O'Connor placed a hand on Harris's shoulder. "Let's focus on helping the family now. They've suffered enough." The group returned to the church where Father O'Connor prepared a small ritual to ensure the curse was fully lifted. He lit candles, recited prayers, and sprinkled holy water around the altar. The officers watched in silence, their respect for the priest growing with each passing moment. Once the ritual was complete, Father O'Connor turned to Harris and Miller. "Now we must ensure the family is taken care of. They'll need food, clothing, and support to rebuild their lives. I'll reach out to the community for help, but I'll need your assistance to make sure they're safe." Harris nodded. "We'll do whatever it takes. That family deserves a second chance." Miller added, "And we'll make sure Victor faces the consequences. No one else should suffer because of him." Over the next few weeks, the community came together to help the family. Donations of food, clothing, and money poured in, and volunteers worked to repair their home. The children were enrolled in school, and the mother found a job at a local bakery. Slowly but surely, their lives began to improve. Harris and Miller kept a close eye on the family, ensuring no further harm came to them. They also worked with Father O'Connor to investigate the cult Victor had mentioned, though the trail went cold. Whoever was behind the dark magic remained hidden, but the officers vowed to stay vigilant. Victor Kane was sentenced to life in prison for his crimes. During his trial, he expressed remorse for his actions, but the damage he had caused could not be undone. The judge made it clear that Victor would never have the opportunity to hurt anyone again. One evening, as the sun set over the cemetery, Harris and Miller stood by the grave that had started it all. The bunny and the needles were gone, replaced by fresh flowers and a small plaque that read, "In loving memory, may peace find you." Harris sighed. "It's strange, isn't it? How something so small, a bunny toy, could cause so much pain." Miller nodded. "But it's also a reminder of how strong people can be. That family survived, and they're thriving now. That's what matters." Father O'Connor joined them, his hands clasped behind his back. "Evil exists in this world, but so does goodness. It's up to us to choose which one we fight for." The three men stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared experience binding them together. They knew there would always be darkness in the world, but they also knew they had the power to bring light. As they walked away from the grave, Harris glanced back one last time. "Do you think we'll ever find the rest of the cult?" Miller shrugged. "Maybe, but for now we've done what we can, and that's enough." Father O'Connor smiled. "It's more than enough. You've given that family a chance to start over. That's what matters." The story of the bunny and the needles became a legend in the town, a cautionary tale about the dangers of black magic and the power of community. And though the scars of the past remained, they served as a reminder of the strength it took to overcome them.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.